Now, here's a very shocking and sad statistic from UNICEF. An estimated 1.2 million children worldwide are subjected to human trafficking every year as a result of insufficient government infrastructure in developing countries and the invisible nature of these terrible crimes. The actual number may be far greater. Shay Cullen has dedicated his career to saving the lives and futures of these exploited children. Since 1975, his Philippines-based nonprofit PREDA Foundation has advocated for human rights and protection for the most vulnerable population. Like other nations in Southeast Asia, the Philippines has its issues with child trafficking. But the problem really reared its ugliness more than ever in the months following Super Typhoon Haiyan. The devastating storm displaced millions and left the region's women and children especially vulnerable to exploitation. Shay Cullen joins us now from Manila to discuss the threat of human trafficking in the aftermath of natural disasters. Shay, welcome to Full Frame. Glad to have you here.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's a very big help for our issue.
Yeah, and it's a big issue at that, as I just mentioned. There are millions of children worldwide that are exploited through human trafficking. Why did you decide to jump into this problem and try and do something about it?
Well, I first came across the problem of human trafficking, especially of children, when I was assigned to work in Longopo City here in the Philippines, which was situated beside the U.S. military naval base at Subic Bay, way back in 1973-74. And I began to see the extent of sex tourism coming here, and of course the big supply for the sex tourist industry in the Philippines is coming from very poor villages and mostly children who are under 18 years of age.
I was just going to say, these are girls that really are in desperate situations, aren't they? They come from total dire poverty from their villages, as you just mentioned.
Yes, the root of this problem, of course, is the overall economic imbalance in the country, the huge gap between the very few rich and, of course, 100 million Filipinos who are living in poverty. And so many children are recruited in the villages and the towns and brought into the cities, and they're victims of human trafficking. So our work is to identify, of course, the traffickers. We work with law enforcement, but also we at PREDA provide rescue for these children, and also recovery and a center whereby they can be empowered and to overcome the trauma. And the traumatization that they suffer is intense, and they need a lot of help to recover.
I can't imagine what they go through and what it takes to try to get them back on their feet. Shay, as I mentioned in my introduction, oftentimes a lot of this exploitation and trafficking happens after a major disaster, like Typhoon Haiyan. Tell me about those conditions. Why is it that a lot of trafficking takes place after a major disaster?
Well, this is very true, and that terrible typhoon at Tacloban City, we went there with my social workers to try and find many of the lost children. You know that so many people were killed in that typhoon. There were homeless children. They'd lost their parents, relatives, and so they are immediately vulnerable to human traffickers who will come and offer them food, and they are starving, hungry children in these disasters. And there is usually not enough response. And in fact, in those days, I had to make quite a lot of campaign and international publicity to get help for those children, because we found out that many were displaced and many were lost, and they really needed special care and help.
Shay, I can't think of another way to describe this, but I just find it so disgusting that in such tragedy, people would take advantage of these children who have lost everything, lost their parents, lost families, and then they're going after these little kids to traffic them. So when you go into these regions and after a disaster like that, it must be heart-wrenching for you to see this happening.
Well, yeah, but we cannot be overwhelmed too much by the emotion, and we want to be very professional immediately. We start the international campaign. Yes, we start information campaigns. We go to all the schools. To prevention is better than cure, and so immediately information campaign among all the poor villages and the refugee camps. And when we were there, walking around one of these places, and we saw foreigners actually going directly there and actually picking up children and sexually abusing them. This is goes on quite a lot there, and sad to say, pedophiles sometimes disguise themselves as charity workers. So we have to really get the government to start monitoring these agencies that go into disaster areas to be sure that they are bona fide and that they are approved and they have some track record. And so they're not just human traffickers trying to pick up children and offer them help and in return getting sexual favors from these children. But we see this is a huge problem. I see it even in Africa, where the United Nations troops in the refugee camps are sexually abusing children as young as 9 years old.
Shay, I'm speechless right now listening to this, because I had no idea that it was that horrible, that people would disguise themselves as relief workers. That's pretty unbelievable to me. But let me ask you, is that a problem then in terms of immediate aid after a disaster? You know, we talk about supplying food and water and clothing, but is this a problem that gets overlooked by aid workers, the trafficking, the exploitation,
right,
because they're dealing with some of the more immediate needs of a disaster?
Immediately, yes, you're right. That's correct. This is what we focus on because of our action to protect children in every circumstance. And at the Preda Foundation, we have a team of response workers, and we really have to go there and set up this information campaign and a center whereby lost children, these children who are wandering around disaster areas and have no parents, they're the most vulnerable. They're like, you know, the refugees. I see already that 10,000 children coming from the war in Syria, from that disaster, are lost in Europe. They've no idea, the authorities don't know where these 10,000 children have gone, and they are very vulnerable and to human trafficking, because after every disaster there is this huge problem with the lost children.
Shay, tell me what it takes then when you go into a situation, whether it be a disaster or just going on the streets in the Philippines to try and save some of these girls. What is that like, to try to get these children and convince them to come with you to the centers, and then talk to me about the process that you go through with these kids to try and rehabilitate them?
Well, okay, the immediate thing we do is identity. The most important thing is to identify the vulnerable children and try and determine their age, and to look immediately. We start looking for their parents, their family. We try to make the little sort of an investigation, so we have their background as much as possible. Then we get these children, and if they're on the streets, it depends on their situation. If they're in a disaster situation, we look for relatives. We look for a shelter in the location, and we will give counseling and therapy in that situation immediately. For those children that we find now in the sex tourist business, they've been brought from these disaster areas. They've been promised jobs as domestic servants. Usually that's the usual story. We'll give you a nice job. You'll work in a beautiful restaurant, hotel. But that's a fake, a cover story. When they bring them up to the city, wherever it may be, the children are then forced into sex bars or into places of prostitution. We have to then rely on information. We at Preda have a hotline. We have an information campaign with hotel workers, social workers, police, and that any indication, or with parents, that if they're missing their children, to let us know, and immediately we have investigators, and we go looking in these places. And when we do find them there, we take the legal action to rescue them and take them out.
Is this an uphill battle for you, though, Shay? Because it seems like child trafficking, sex trafficking, has been around for a very long time. And it's almost this vicious cycle that takes place because there's still the demand, and so therefore, and the poverty still exists, so the cycle just goes round and round. So is this an uphill battle, or do you feel like you're making some headway?
Yes. Well, in some cases we are, but in the overall, I'm sad to say that in the overall international situation, you know, it's slavery of people is growing. There's human slavery is everywhere, and slavery in the international sex industry is getting bigger. Yeah. The lack of enforcement is a big problem here. The lack of care. We have a care center. We do these children can recover. They are traumatized. They are very much damaged by this terrible sex exploitation which goes on. There's cyber sex of many children are put in front of webcams now, and they're being sold over the web. Forced to do sex acts in front of a camera. So they're quite traumatized, and the recovery process is, takes about a year and a half. Wow. But we do have success. We do see the lives coming back to these terribly depressed and despondent children. They come alive, and they find new hope when they get all the affirmation, the support, the encouragement, respect, and education and therapy. We give them at Preda Center. We specialize in emotional expression therapy, whereby the children are encouraged and they're able to bring out a lot of their emotions and all their feelings, and able to release all that anger and hatred for their rapists and abusers. So it is encouraging to see that these children can recover and get well. So that's an encouragement. On the other hand, the lack of what we really need is, with all countries, including the United States, is a joint interdiction force with a shared sovereignty of jurisdiction by the law enforcers. The reason is that the human traffickers are getting away with it here because the weak law enforcement. And so we need an international team to do this.
Thank you so much for sharing the news of your work, and it's amazing what you're doing for these young girls. So I thank you for your time, Shay.
Okay, and thank you also. I think this is also thanking you in the media for exposing the truth and the reality of what's happening in our world.
All right. Well, we'll do our best. Thank you so much, Shay. We'll be right back with this week's Full Frame Close-Up.